Yo, listen, would you hold on? I've got something important. Sometimes our law sense proper, sometimes I think it's rotten. For those who stand for freedom, will soon get an arrest warrant. In this witch hunt so brutal, friend justice is forgotten. Today we take a stand for all arrested people who stood up for the rights of many souls so feeble. Democracy's in danger, man. The time to act is now. We take a stand against the arrest in the case of Bhima Koregaon. Lawyers and poets and social activists got arrested falling prey to some bigot's prejudice. How can we just keep quiet? How can we sleep in peace? Let's stand up now, let's wake up now and demand each one's release. Sudha Bharadwaj, Gautam Navlakha, Varavar Rao, Arun Ferreira, Vernon Gonzalez, Shoma Sen, Anand Teltumde, Father Stan Swami, and others. Today we take a stand for all.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you from whichever part of the world you are joining us. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the monthly series organized by INSAF India. INSAF India stands for International Solidarity for Academic Freedom in India. We are a collective of diasporic academics and concerned citizens from different parts of the world campaigning for academic freedom in India. My name is Shruti Bala. Together with my colleague and comrade Sangeeta Kamath, I will be moderating today's session titled Ideas Behind Bars, the Bhima Koregaon case of imprisoned civic activists and India's autocratic turn. As we all know, India is currently reeling under a nightmarishly devastating COVID emergency. The country's shortage of oxygen is tragically not only true of the hospitals, but has become an apt metaphor for the growing suffocation of freedoms and rights to livelihood at various levels, all of which have only been exacerbated and revealed to us through the current COVID tsunami by way of an autopsy of our society. According to the VDEM report of 2020, the Varieties of Democracy report, India, which likes to call itself the world's largest democracy, has been termed an electoral autocracy. Indian citizens are under increased surveillance, imprisonment, and censorship, while the basic freedoms of speech and the democratic right to dissent have been acutely threatened. We have become a deeply polarized society. This webinar proposes to critically examine the strategies employed by the government to target individuals and all forms of dissent, which make apparent the mechanisms of this autocratic turn. Through the lens of the Bhima Koregaon case, that includes 16 people incarcerated since 2018, and hence the short form BK16, we aim to explore how different strategies of suppression are coming together to destabilize democratic structures and constrict public discourse, freedom of speech, and dissent. I would like to invite Sangeeta to introduce our distinguished panelists and this session for today. Sangeeta, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Shruti. I'm really delighted to welcome our panelists today. And in the interest of time, my introductions to them are going to be very brief, and it's not going to adequately cover the excellent work they do that is in the defense of human rights and civil liberties. Let me begin with introducing Jed Crandall. He's Associate Professor at the School of Computing, Informatics, and Decision Systems Engineering at Arizona State University. He is also affiliated with the Biodesign Center for Biocomputation, Security, and Society at ASU. We also have Suchitra Vijayan, founder and executive director of the Panelist Project, a research and investigative journalism organization, which is a rare thing in today's world. And the Panelist Project brings us analysis on critical issues, including the work they have done on the BK16 case. Suchitra is also author of Midnight's Borders, and it's a book that is just going to be released, in fact, I think next month, and it's on the people who live along the contested borders of India. Tarnav Khaitan, he is Professor of Public Law and Legal Theory and Vice Dean of Faculty of Law at Oxford University. I'll very briefly introduce ourselves, the moderators for today's session. I am a professor of international education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Shruti Bala, my co-moderators, associate professor in theater studies at the University of Amsterdam. I hope that everyone has watched the 5-minute explainer video that we shared with the announcement that went out about this webinar, which is the strange case against the Bhima Koregaon political prisoners that was released by the Panelist Project, which is sort of really gives a really excellent 5-minute introduction to the case. The format that we're going to have today is we're going to have 3 rounds of questions. The first round will be very specific to the case itself. And the second round of questions are going to be putting the arrests in a broader context of looking at states, judiciaries, and surveillance technology. And the final round of questions, we're going to be really looking ahead and just think about sort of what are the ways to move forward. We hope to sort of really cover, the presentations in about a total of 60 to 70 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A with the audience, which we hope, we're going to have about 20 to 30 minutes. For the Q&A, I would really want you to post your questions and comments in the Q&A section that is on Zoom, the button that's on Zoom, and we're going to take as many as we can in the time that we have. We're going to open up for the first round of questions, and here I'm going to turn to Shruti to open the first question to our panelists.
Thank you, Sangeeta. So I want to start with you, Suchitra. You have been observing and covering this case as a journalist right from its start. And on the face of it, those who have been arrested are a very, very diverse group. They're community activists, lawyers, they come from different fields, diverse social backgrounds, and often even coming from very different, do not always share the same political views. So, but what is it that they have been doing or are doing that the government is so concerned to stop them? What are the ideas and the actions for which these 16 people are behind bars?
Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, Sangeeta. Thank you, everybody who's part of INSAF for organizing these conversations. These conversations are important, not as aptly pointed out, we are living through what one would call precarious, and I'm being very generous with that description. And these acts of conversations are also important acts of little mutinies. So thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge that many of you joining in today have family back in India, and it's not an easy time. So I really appreciate all of you making the time to be here. It means so much to me and so many others, including the researchers at Panelist Project who have worked on this for so long, and many, many others who've tirelessly worked on this for many years. I want to start by placing the Bhima Koregaon case in the larger historical context. And where does one start than to go back to Dr. Ambedkar, who says that the Indian Constitution, while started with political equality, social justice and social equality, never became a part of it. So from the beginning of the Republic, what we really have are a series of acts of resistance. Political prisoners emerged in India soon after the early years of independence. I've said this publicly many times. My grandfather was independent India as one of the first political prisoners, again arrested for organizing strikes of workers. So what kind of brings the BK16 together? One, all of them are folks who have worked for the dignity of the common man. These are people who are on the ground. These are people who are defending those who are most farthest away from the legal system. I'm not going to use the word marginalized or the voiceless because I don't think that quite captures what happens. So for someone like Shudha Bharadwaj, many others, what they really did was be in solidarity, fight, and fight with them. And these were people, as I said, were farthest away from the legal system, farthest away from the centers of power. So that is one aspect. The second thing are these are the same people who, with moral, political, and social clarity, have always been consistent critiques of a certain kind of Hindutva and neoliberal politics. Of course, Dr. Anand Teltumde has a long history of writing about this. Second, what you're really seeing is they're not just arresting people for what they did, they're arresting people for who they are and what they represent. They're arresting you for the act of idea. Political prisoner itself is an egregious category. It's a category that should not exist as a criminal offense in any democracies, but it exists. And the political crime here, the crime here is a crime, as I said, of act of thinking, being, fighting, resisting, holding the state accountable. So what you're really seeing is anyone who is now questioning the state. And these are people who have consistently questioned the state. Another thing that I really want to place this is that the Bhima Koregaon or BK16 is not just a function of one political party. Of course, what is happening right now is really, really bad, but we have to place this within the longer history of resistance, longer history of criminalization of dissent. And that's the only way for us to think about this and fight about this, because this political party might tomorrow leave. But what we really need to think is how do we then go ahead and dismantle the legal regimes, legal structures? How do we dismantle the ways in which ideological foot soldiers have now been stacked in various institutions of power, who will continue to not only disregard the constitution that provides equality, or at least on paper supposed to provide legal, political, and social equality. So I'll leave it at there, and then I'm sure there are other threads that we can pick up and go in detail.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm going to, thank you, Suchitra, for that. I'm going to turn to Tarun Khaitan, our panelist, who's a constitutional lawyer, for the next question. And Tarun, this question, is really in two parts that I'm going to be asking you. One is, these cases have been rife with government propaganda, full of falsehoods, and using laws that are themselves unconstitutional. Evidence has been fabricated, stories have been flipped, victims have been cast as the accused, even before we have any, even whiff of a trial. And there's this targeting of academics, lawyers, and activists that's clearly evident. What are the implications of this for democratic constitutionalism? And do you see these as discrete cases, or do you see a systematic pattern that is of concern? And then my second part of this question, or maybe you want to take this and then I can come to the second part.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Sangeeta, for inviting me to this panel. And, as an academic and a scholar of democracy, especially constitutional democracy, to my mind, these cases very much fit within a systemic pattern. So I want to start by just endorsing what Suchitra just told us, that in some ways there is nothing new here, because every regime in the past has employed similar means. What is new is the volume of, and for people who are interested, I wrote a paper called Killing a Constitution with 1,000 Cuts. So what previous regimes did once in a while, this regime has done very frequently. What previous regimes did with a sense of shame, this regime has done openly and unabashedly. And what previous regimes did in what we might think of as the margins of the nation, by which I mean Kashmir and Northeast, right? In those places, this kind of power play is not new, right? But moving that power play to what you might consider constitutionally normal areas of the state, territories of the state, which are not under some sort of state of declared or undeclared emergency. That is novel under this regime. So what that means, so for example, most, if not all, and I'm not commenting on the intricacies of the case because I'm not a criminal lawyer, but using criminal law to go after people who are using constitutionally permissible methods to make demands on the state, so the Bharadwaj is using one of the key parts of the state, the courts. She's an advocate, right? So going after those people in areas that are outside zones of permanent emergencies, that is highly unusual under this regime. And going after them not through, so you would have the occasional use of defamation laws, but going after, heavy duty anti-sedition laws or anti-terror laws, that is unique to this regime. And obviously, without the emergency of the 1970s, which was its own unique case. Its implications, I think, are dire for democracy, because democracy definitionally requires that power is temporary, that power is accountable, and that power is in the service of all the people. Right? So in the paper whose link I've just posted, the argument I've made is this, that this regime is hollowing out democracy from the inside, and that requires power to become permanent. The parties hold over power to become permanent, even while we go through performative electioneering process, so you acquire the legitimacy of a formal democracy, hence the VDM tag of an electoral autocracy, that you have elections, but there is no doubt who will win, or at least there's little doubt that who will form government, right? So it's, while the opposition is genuine, it has its hands tied behind its back. And one of the things that this kind of regime does is it goes after people who seek accountability because they're irritants, right? So I see the Bhima Koregaon case as one part of a systematic move against these irritants to power, because they make power fragile and temporary. So it's very much it fits the broader scheme of, and I think it's quite a concerted blueprint, and outlined 3 different modes of accountability seeking that democracies seek to ensure. One of them is discursive accountability, which is accountability through truth telling and truth seeking. It's largely done by activists, media, and the universities. And it's not a surprise that it is primarily these 3 sites in civil society, activists, journalists, and academics, who have been targeted by the regime. You're muted.
Thank you very much for that, Tarun. And just elaborating a little bit more, I know, not, without going into legal intricacies, to say a little bit about sort of how does it become so easy, to sort of charge and arrest and jail people, right, on these very flimsy kinds of grounds. And on the other hand, very difficult to legally dismiss, these really flimsy cases. Like what's sort of, leading to that?
So that has a very long history. And I think, again, picking up on Suchitra's opening remarks, we inherited a colonial system of policing, which was designed to service the authoritarian state. And while we inherited that system, there has been no serious attempt under the democratic post-colonial state to seriously change that system. So we have a system of policing and the system of criminal justice with a fair measure of independence for the courts. I'll come to that in a moment, and I know that you have questions about that later. But by and large, policing and prosecutorial services have not been made independent of the partisan state of the executive, which is often described as the most dangerous branch. So far, we have largely rested on the security of relatively benign regimes, which were bound by, not by so much what they could do, but by a sense of shame. There was a constitutional shamelessness about the new regime, which means that it does not feel bound by those soft norms, right, of what is doable and what's not doable. So that's one change. The second is that the security that class brought is no longer applicable. Right? So the Indian police has always been arbitrary. It's largely been arbitrary to the poor, against the poor. So class was a huge source of security. The middle class, people we I think quite euphemistically call the middle classes in India, obviously the rich, were not targeted by the police, except in odd cases, which, like in cases which are controversial, right? Like dowry harassment or 498A or dowry deaths, right? Those were cases where middle-class people were targeted by the police, and that's why, there was a huge movement against them. But class gave you a certain sense of security against criminal justice systems, and that has gone under this regime as well. So it's always been easy to charge, arrest, and jail people if the regime wanted to go after you, because the process itself is the punishment. You've spent 4 or 5 years in jail, and acquittal at the end of the day with a relatively independent court is still meaningless, right? The second thing, I just want to make a quick footnote here, which is that for all the abuse that liberals get from the left, this is a failure to realize one of the central tenets of liberalism and the rule of law, which just makes an authoritarian takeover so easy. This is the difference between what Trump could not do in the US and what Modi could do in India, because the system was independent and the system worked. So all regimes have failed here. It's just that we don't have a relatively, and I use relatively quite self-consciously, a relatively benign regime anymore, and it's using the powers that have always been available to governments in India ever since colonial times.
Thank you so much for that. And yeah, I think Anand Teltumre, in fact, one of the ones who was arrested, he said the process is the punishment. And I think, that's very much sort of what you're highlighting here. And I'm going to turn to Shruti to take on, take forward the discussion.
Take forward this discussion by focusing on one aspect, which is really something new in at least our experience of criminal persecution, which is the surveillance and cybersecurity. And since you are a cybersecurity expert, Jed, this question is addressed to you. So for more than 2 years, a recent report, an independent report, has shown that remote access malware has been used systematically to plant incriminating documents on the personal computers of at least one of the arrested. Could you please, for those in the audience which have not followed this case so far, could you please summarize the findings of this report? And what is significant? Tell us what is significant about it.
Okay. Yeah, and thank you for having me. So the short version is the report very clearly shows that it was a remote access Trojan being controlled remotely that put the incriminating documents on the laptop and not the user of the laptop. And to dig a little more into what that means, in digital investigation and forensics, there's different kinds of information that you can get. And usually information about what's called a process tree, which is exactly, who created which processes. A process is like an application. So, you use Microsoft Word, or you use, Zoom is another application, and those would be associated with processes. And then if somebody installs malware on your computer, and the report clearly shows that the malware came from an email that looked like it was from a trusted associate of Rona Wilson, and then it got into the laptop that way. And then when that malware is running and then is reaching out on the internet for instructions, that malware is a process too. You can't see it on the screen. It's not like Microsoft Word or Zoom that you see on the screen, but it is a process that's running on the system. And typically you can only go back, you know, maybe hours or days and have that rich of information to show these are the processes that were running on the system and this is what they were doing. So if you have a process tree, the process tree not only tells you like who created what processes and what those processes did, but it also gives you information about the file system. So if there's a file that's on the hard drive, it tells you this is the process that created that file. It downloaded the file from the internet and it renamed it and it put it here. And usually you can only go back hours or days with that kind of information, but what the Arsenal report has been able to do is to look in the parts of the hard drive where people should be looking, but it's not as common to look there as it should be, where information has been copied that was old and then saved just because of the way that computers work. So computers are constantly mixing what's called volatile memory, so your RAM, that when you turn off the computer, it goes away. And then non-volatile memory, which is your hard drive, that every time you turn off the computer, it stays. And the way that computers work for different performance reasons, and you know, whenever you hibernate, for example, is that those get mixed a lot. And so if you're looking for a process tree, which is typically associated with volatile memory, what the Arsenal team was able to do is to look for copies of volatile memory that had been made over the, you know, the period of 22 months and put together over those 22 months a process tree, which is, it's kind of the gold standard of digital forensics. It's, you know, the second report from Arsenal uses the word smoking gun, and that's not a term they would use lightly. You know, they're well respected in the field, and it really is a smoking gun. This is as good as evidence gets for digital investigation, is a process tree that shows clearly over the 22 months, these were the processes and these are what they did. And all of the processes that are associated with somebody sitting at the laptop and using the keyboard and looking at the screen, there's no interaction between those processes and the incriminating documents. And then there's a very clear process tree that shows the malware that got into the laptop through email. It very clearly shows that over time, the processes associated with that malware are downloading the documents from the internet and then decompressing them and putting them on the hard drive and then naming them into things that look incriminating and things like that. So, and you can see that from the process tree that they recreated. So, I mean, it really is, you know, the two words smoking gun are not an overstatement. Like, that really is as good as digital evidence gets. And in terms of the implications of this, so I've been doing research for a long time in the general area of internet freedom. So we look at internet surveillance, we look at internet censorship, and I have colleagues, for example, at the Citizen Lab that have done a lot of work looking at remote access Trojans, which is a type of, you know, it's like a computer virus that somebody puts on your device to control it and then do surveillance. And in this case, plant documents. And there's always a general theme of trying to limit the sphere of influence of whoever you're targeting. So if you're censoring, you know, keywords about an event, we often think of censorship as like they don't want people talking about this particular event, when really, usually they're targeting specific users with that censorship. They're trying to stop those specific users from using those words to gain an audience and then talk about that specific thing. But it's more about the sphere of influence. And so that is common with, you know, all the other types of information controls we've looked at. In this case, is that these are people that were developing a sphere of influence. And then the people, you know, somebody was opposed to that and installed the malware and injected incriminating evidence to stop that sphere of influence from growing. But it's an escalation in terms of the kinds of things that we've seen, just in terms of being very rare. I mean, like I said, we've seen censorship, and then we've seen, you know, people use remote access Trojans, and then while they're on the laptop, they're doing surveillance. So they're saying, well, who are this journalist sources? Who are they talking to? And we've seen a lot of that. And, you know, there's been a lot of egregious things that I've seen over the years, but this is unique in the incriminating evidence was planted by the remote access Trojan. You know, of course, there's always the possibility that there's cases out there where it happened and it wasn't caught because there wasn't as detailed, you know, as well done of an analysis as Arsenal did. But in terms of places, you know, cases where I can point to and say, you know, somebody used this technique as an information control to go after an activist or a journalist or something like that, there's only two. There's this case, and then Arsenal did a previous report in Turkey where they showed something similar had happened in Turkey. And those are the only two where there, you know, there's prominent cases of this particular thing clearly being done. So from my perspective, it's an escalation in terms of seeing how, you know, people that are developing spheres of influence are getting attacked through digital means such as censorship or remote access Trojans. It's very unique and, you know, very you know, an escalation in terms of using remote access Trojans for something that I haven't seen something quite so you know, quite so blunt, I guess would be the word. So
thank you. Shocking as it is, I'd still like to know your responses to the fact that this evidence, this report, which is like smoking gun, as you've just said, despite it being gold standard, clear evidence of digital surveillance, posting incriminating documents. Why do you think how do you respond to the NIA, National Investigative Agency's refusal to accept this report, to take it into consideration? What are your responses to that?
Yeah, it's definitely striking because in terms of the technical aspects of the case, yeah, I mean, it's very clear what happened, and it's very clear that the evidence was planted, and it's not open to interpretation. So I've seen various, I guess you could call them attempted rebuttals at the Arsenal report, and they were things that are, you know, basically absurd. So, you know, one was that somehow somebody tampered with the image that Arsenal was given. And there's very clear technical means in place to prevent that from happening. So anybody that wants to see if that happened or not, if you look at the top of the Arsenal report, there's long numbers. And those long numbers verify the exact image that was taken off of Rona Wilson's hard drive and the USB stick. And so anybody that wants to claim, well, somehow somebody changed it before it was given to Arsenal, they just have to look at those numbers and then get their own copy from the, you know, the prosecution, I suppose, of that hard drive, that USB, and then they can confirm those numbers. And the other defenses I've seen, like, you know, it's open to interpretation. I mean, to anybody that understands how operating systems works and, you know, knows the technical underpinnings of the report, it's not open to interpretation at all. I mean, once you've recovered those records, the records of a process tree can be clearly put together in a well-defined way, and they tell you know, a very precise story, so that there's no room for interpretation at all. And so I can't comment like on the legal context and the social context, but in terms of the technical misinformation, I mean, it's clearly absurd. So it's striking to me that, you know, whatever other contexts are surrounding the case other than the technical context, that those could, you know, basically stop the case from being thrown out, even though the technical case is so well put together. So
yeah, thank you. Suchitra, would you like to come into this and respond in terms of evidence?
Sure. Shruti, I think there are two things that if anyone even tries to go in and look at what we have to understand the two issues, right? One, we have immense procedural irregularities that have haunted the case from the beginning. And second is the question of burden of proof. So in terms of procedural irregularities, what you really have is, let's start with a brief list. First, you have evidence that is claimed to have been recovered by the police. And now we know that a lot of this evidence is fabricated, or the ways in which they were acquired was wrong. Second, you have a long list of unjustified pretrial detentions of everyone, Mr. Sudha Bharadwaj, Arun Ferreira, all of them, right? So that you have the sense of, also we are in the middle of a global pandemic and none of these bail applications came through. Then you have things like failure to translate the first information reports in the languages that could be understood. There was lack of independent public or private public witness when to arrest or seizure memos. So again, there were prejudicial public statements that were leaked to the press that should not have been leaked. Then a lot of the statements by the police actually challenged and went against existing procedural rules. And what you really see is a consistent pattern of filing charges that could not be that does not actually stand the test of any kind of evidentiary laws. Now, the second thing is the question of burden of proof, right? One thing that people should understand is that the charge sheet that was filed had two kinds of information, right? The first was the fact that the first information report that was filed was completely disregarded and not taken into account. Only the second one was. In addition to that, you have, the police, and if you look at what evidence that we have, we know that one set of evidence in front of us is completely fabricated, and another set of evidence is actually evidence that doesn't even stand the test of any kind of evidentiary procedures. And again, there have been series of concerns that have been raised from the beginning. So I think it's very important for us to kind of go back to the basics and keep fine. The new report that has come out is absolutely damning. It's a smoking gun. But even without that report, what you really see play out is egregious. In any constitutional democracy, these kinds of evidentiary and burden of proof violations should not be happening.
Yeah, thank you, Suchitra. Tarun, you mentioned you just wanted to comment on this as well.
Yeah, so just to put this again in the historical context, evidence planting and evidence fabrication is not a new thing in Indian policing. In fact, it's almost a modus operandi, and not always for the motives are complex. It's in part the political dimension of this case makes us complicated, but we also need to understand that this is a highly overworked, underpaid, and underskilled police force that uses evidence planting as a mechanism to cut corners when proper investigative mechanisms and training and tools are not available, right? So it's ingrained in the Indian policing system to do, and we used to have almost laughable cases where the same piece of evidence was photographed against the so-called Maoists, right? With the same marginal notes even, and just left in their homes. So in some ways, the technical evidence planting is worse from the prosecution's point of view, because the fact that it's fabricated is much easier to show than physical evidence that is planted. So we should not lose sight of the fact that we have tolerated this very system for an extremely long time because it mainly worked against the poor, and it's the first time that it is catching people like us. And so I'm not denying the appallingness of the system, but the system has allowed this to happen for a very long time.
Thank you for that important kind of historical also contextualization of this. Sangeeta, I'd like to hand over to you to move to the kind of second round of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to sort of take some of the where we just left off with Jed, talking about sort of the kind of technological sort of use of technology, right, to plant evidence. Because it's really sort of a very chilling sort of new situation, even though, Tarun says, yes, this has been done, and has been a modus operandi for a long time of planting of evidence. But the use of sort of technological power, and then now we look at it sort of, in the hands of, governments that are really autocratic, right? And this is not something that, and again, this kind of autocratic government is something that we are seeing not just in India, but, in other places too. And so, Jed, could you say something about what are the ways in which states need to or can be regulated in this kind of use of, surveillance technology and, and to really sort of, incriminate innocent citizens at will?
Yeah, I think in terms of regulation, it's hard to separate the private industry that's cropped up that does this kind of thing from the state actors. Sometimes it's a matter of, and it might have been the case, they haven't, there hasn't been anything that's come out yet about like who installed the remote access Trojan and then who is controlling it. So I can't comment on that, but in general, the most common way that it's done is that state actors will, if it is a state actor that's doing it, they'll contract out to a company. So there are companies that actually do the surveillance and have the infrastructure. But there is the option of taking something and just compiling it yourself and doing it yourself. And I don't know what the case was in this case, but what's striking about this case is the amount of persistence that went into it. So it's really hard to get software to run on somebody's computer. You can just imagine the support teams, like Zoom, for example. They have a huge support team and they have, probably a huge development team to keep things running so that it runs on your computer. And this is an app that you want to run on your computer. Whereas a virus is something you don't want to run on your computer, and you install things on your computer to make the virus stop working, and you keep updating the thing to make the virus stop working. So it's even harder to keep a virus working on somebody's computer than it is to keep something like Zoom working. So you can imagine the team that had to keep this running for 22 months to be able to command this thing for 22 months and keep it running. It's not like an individual could do that, could just download something off the internet and then compile it, and then anybody could do that. They could do the downloading and the compile and then install it on your computer. But keeping it running for 22 months and being able to carry out actions and keep things running smoothly for that long of a period of time, there was a team backing up whoever was doing that. And so it is, there is the context of evidence being planted, perhaps being a common thing, but that's something very uncommon about it, is that persistence, that level of effort and persistence and the resources that went into it.
Right. Thanks for that. Indeed, like it's, we're all waiting to know who was it behind this, with so much of time and so much of resources at hand to be able to accomplish this. Tarun, I'd like to move on to a question to you, somehow also connecting to Sangeeta's question. Can you talk about the judiciary's role in safeguarding the right to personal liberty guaranteed by the Constitution? That would be the first part. Can you please, expand this a little bit more?
Sure, thanks, Shruti. And actually, this is a good segue because, just to add to what Jed said about the persistence being different in this case, it's the reaction of other institutions, which is also a key difference in this case. I cannot imagine, so while evidence planting has always been common persistent practice, a case of this level of public salience and this kind of forensic response from reliable sources showing, publicly the fabrication, no other government could have survived, or its persistence would not have lasted for so long. So other institutions, the media, civil society would have worked in ways for the government to back down by now. So it's that lack of constitutional shame, but also because the attack is not just targeted on civil society actors, sort of discursive accountability seeking actors. The attack is also targeted towards horizontal or state accountability seeking actors, primarily the target has been the political opposition, which has just been completely emasculated everywhere using law and extra legal methods, but also all the other independent state institutions, whether it's the auditors, the election commission, etc. And the judiciary has obviously been a prime target. Now, India has had a strange judiciary for a very long time. It has had capacity issues, structure issues, delay issues, pendency issues, but its independence has not really been seriously questioned in the past. Its quality of its judgments has been, whether it got things right or not has been. Its independence has come into question, at least at the higher level, talking about high courts and Supreme Court, and this level of public focus on clear miscarriage of justice not goading the court into action is unusual. Now, I don't think that the Indian judiciary has been captured. I don't think that is true. It is also...
You don't think the Indian judiciary has
been captured as an institution. I also don't think that it is independent like it used to be. So the Indian judiciary, my sense is a complicated polyvocal institution where there are clear signs of its independence having been compromised. Some of these are direct but credible allegations coming from sitting and former judges, including the famous or infamous judges' press conference, including post-retirement political appointments that judges, Rajya Sabha seat, governorship, they're not unprecedented, but they are extremely unusual, and judiciary has tended to stay away from that. They come from the Prime Minister meeting Chief Justice of India behind closed doors. That's unprecedented. So there are signs that there is the signs of pressure on judicial independence and credible allegations of that pressure. It's obviously hard from the outside to assess the credibility without a formal investigation. But all these allegations are supported by at least some circumstantial evidence of highly irregular judicial behavior that simply cannot be explained by normal legal sources. Right? So this highly irregular behavior in certain key politically salient cases where the ruling party's interests are clearly at stake, combined with a series of credible allegations coming from judges themselves and clear political benefits being given to judges who have acted in ways that may be seen as beneficial to the regime, together add up to a volume of evidence that is hard to dismiss. Having said that, there are very brave judges who are standing up to the system. Often in the high courts, they're facing transfers, they're facing refusals to promote them despite consistent recommendations to do so. So it's a complicated system. An independent judiciary, there are serious elements in the judiciary that are fighting and standing up for its independence. How this turns out remains to be seen. But what I can say with academic certainty is that it's highly likely that this kind of pressure on judicial independence and integrity has not been seen in India since the days of the emergency in the 1970s.
But if I could just press you a little bit further in this question, you talk of highly irregular behavior, which you feel is, you're saying is not usual, but do you see any transformations in the judiciary as such that, and which are not individual related behavior, highly individual related behavior, which should be of concern or of concern to the legal community at large?
So, because the judiciary acts through individual cases, it's usually is usually these highly irregular cases. So cases where the Chief Justice sits in a petition that clearly affects his own interests, breaching the first norm of not being a judge in your own case, the refusal to investigate Judge Loya's death, for example. So these are examples of high irregularity. The denial of bail in cases where a lot of these accused are clearly not at risk of, incapable in some cases of fleeing the reach of the law, and highly, good evidence, prima facie evidence of the cases are fabricated. So these are the highly irregular cases. On the other side, so the other fact which is deeply worrying is obviously the extremely arbitrary, opaque, and non-transparent administrative powers of the Chief Justice of India, but that is not new. So the arbitrariness and the opaqueness has been around for a long time. It's just that you have had benign Chief Justices who have not abused that power, and you have less benign Chief Justices who signs are have abused that power. So the system in some ways has always been fragile and weak. So the same thing I said about policing, I'm also saying about judiciary. The system of promotion of judges to the Supreme Court, the system of transferring judges as punishment postings, the system of the administrative oversight, which case goes to which bench, has always been under the power of the Chief Justice. Former Chief Justices have abided by soft norms, right? That the 5 senior most judges will hear the most important constitutional cases. But these have only been conventions, right? And when new Chief Justices have refused to abide by them, you can think dal mein kuch kala hai, right? As in, what's going on here? But it's within their power to do so, because we have not created a robust system where one individual does not have the power to do things, right? We have just rested on the some blind faith in the goodness of these individuals. So which is why we can only cite this kind of irregularities, both judicial in the orders, which are inexplicable, sometimes really badly reasoned, even by the quality standards. When you write thousands of judgments a year, quality is hard to maintain, but even by those standards, some judgments just can't be. One judgment in the Ayodhya case, which was unsigned, that's highly irregular. When judges don't put their name after a judgment and don't own up to, I have written this, is highly irregular. So it's matters like this, and post sort of non-bench irregularity of becoming an MP after being a Chief Justice, or a governorship, or meeting the Prime Minister in office behind closed doors. So it's little acts which, in a robust, well-functioning constitutional democracy, you could have brushed off your shoulders, and it would have invited political criticism, media criticism. If you had a sense of shame, you would have apologized and moved on. But when the evidence piles up, these little incremental sort of problems, I think, systemically point to a potentially larger malaise within the system.
Okay, thank you. Suchitra, I'm actually curious to know if you would like to respond to what Tarun just said. What are your observations of this as a journalist?
I started my life as a lawyer and a litigator, and then I became a writer and a researcher. So one of the things you learn early on is that, there's this famous saying that says, Caesar's wife should be seen beyond, the idea being that in public life, probity is absolutely important. It's not only essential that the sense of legality, integrity is maintained, it should be seen to be maintained. And I think for a very long time, that sense of trust in the Indian judiciary has been eroding. And in a democracy, when trust in the judiciary erodes, and you consistently see those meant, I want to kind of come a step back, is that One of the revolutionary things about the Indian Constitution, with all its flaws, is the fact that the fundamental rights are supposed to be interpreted in favor of the citizen and not the state. Might seem quite benign now, but it's a very revolutionary idea. Somehow that seems to have been eroded. And I think what Tarun did was, was a very cool-headed indictment, everything that he said, one after another after another. And that's a deep indictment of an erosion of a system. In a democracy, if not anything, especially in a republic, systems are what maintains balance. So that's very important. I think the sense of trust in the Indian judiciary has waned and eroded for a really long time. One of the things I said in my first answer is those farthest away from the centers of power and judiciary have always known this. The second aspect of this is that one of the projects that I started working on a few years ago, which is still a work in progress, is how do we think about the relationship between violence and justice? If those who are on the receiving end of violence, various kinds of violence, I'm not just talking physical violence, real violence, bureaucratic violence, have consistently gone through the judicial system, but the system itself has consistently failed them. What is the relationship between judiciary and violence? And then are we still a republic if our laws do not maintain a certain kind of justice outcomes, right? So I think that is very important. Finally, we also have to acknowledge that the Indian judicial system is a deeply casteist, patriarchal, misogynistic institution. Continues to be and has been for a really long time. Let's take into account the men, it's often been called the Brahmin Court of India, not the Supreme Court of India, or the Savarna Court of India, not the Supreme Court of India. The deeply misogynistic statements and deeply, quite frankly, some rather terrible judgments that seem to be not interpreting the fundamental rights in favor of the citizen, but the state. Now, I won't disagree with Tarun in the sense that from my point of view, my vantage point of view, it feels like all of these instances could actually amount to perhaps a certain kind of an institutional capture, a certain kind of erosion, a certain kind of stalking of an ideological foot soldier. And I just want to put in an example. When the demonetization happened, I filed one of the earliest petitions. The first petition was filed in the Madurai High Court. And this is available for public record. The judge then says it's the duty of the citizen to bow to the state and allow the state to do things. It almost said that the language of bowing to the state actually goes back to the monarchical idea of, bowing to a certain sovereign figure. We don't have sovereign figures. What we have is a republic. But imagine a sitting high court judge saying so in a judgment that the citizen should bow to the state. I would say these are egregious. Today, if you look at some of the most important decisions, whether it is, again, nothing came out of the demonetization petition, nothing came out of the one that's happening in Kashmir. Today, you have even what just played out yesterday with hospitals going to the Supreme Court. I think, in my opinion, I would actually say perhaps I would conclude that the institutional capture perhaps has already happened. Maybe there are notable exceptions, but I fear that the institutional capture perhaps might have happened. I, in this way, believe that I tend to be less optimistic about how I see our institutions.
Tarun, do you want to quickly respond to that before we move to the next question?
Sure. So I just want to clarify that I'm certainly not optimistic about certain things that are going on. When I say I don't think the Indian Supreme Court is captured, I have a very special meaning of institutional capture in mind, which is when one institution is captured by another, in this case, the ruling party. I don't think structurally and institutionally the ruling party in India has captured the courts as an institution, even while certain individuals may well have been compromised. That does not mean that the court has acted well, because you don't need to be captured to do bad things. You can do bad things on your own accord, right? So you could call it ideological capture, right? Which is different from, I would not use the word capture as ideological capture. Right? The court has done ideologically appalling things, which are entirely against the founding constitutional vision and ethos, right? And in some ways, the court has even been the cheerleader of, the drum rolls of fascism around the country. And I don't think that we need to make the institutional capture claim. I just don't think we have enough evidence in the public domain to make the institutional capture claim. But when it comes to Assam and NRC and the statelessness of millions of Indians and the denial of citizenship rights, I have no doubt that the court has blood on its hands, and it has acted perhaps worse than many fascist governments might have acted. It's so the claim that the court is not captured is not an endorsement of everything the court has done. It's just a different type of problem in my head.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. I'd like to move on to the next question. So Sangeeta will take over from me.
Yeah, thank you. This has been such a valuable discussion, and I want to pick up some threads, from what Suchitra, is talking about, and it's coming from this conversation about sort of the wider, changing sort of social-political, configuration in the country. And I think, your work, Suchitra, and the Polis project can really sort of shed light on this issue because, and the title of our webinar is about ideas behind bars. And here are people for their ideas and actions being put behind bars, right? And so I'd like you to sort of elaborate a little bit on sort of, the kind of work, these are academics, these are writers, these are artists, performers, these are human rights lawyers, that are behind bars. And so, how does sort of their work sort of connect to wider social movements that have been going on in the country against the corporate takeover of land, for instance, on forest rights, or caste atrocities, worker rights, and so forth. So if you could say a little bit about, the work and how that, their work and how it connects to wider social movements in the country. And also to say a little bit about, because I think often this gets left out of the discussion, is around, the really valuable work that artists and performers do in a society, in a democratic society, right? And here we have artists and performers being imprisoned, unable to perform without fear of arrest. And, how do you see sort of also then the implications, consequences for cultural production and artistic freedom in India?
Suchitra, you're muted.
I want to break this down into smaller parts. The first thing, of course, is that the Indian state has always been brutal and ruthless in terms of suppression of dissent, right? Long before, for example, a good example is Kodangulam. Like before I come to the BK16, the Kodangulam nuclear reactor case is one of the first instances when we had mass FIRs filed. I think close to 9,000, if I'm not mistaken, where entire villages were put under these mass FIRs. And it affected, again, predominantly fisherfolk whose livelihood, which again made it a cover to pick them up anytime, hold them accountable. You, of course, had the case of Perumal Murugan, the writer, again being, in this case, it was not your BJP government, but in this case, in localized spaces, it was coming together of a certain kind of caste and Hindutva politics. That is, also history and memory is very local, which means that there was an attempt. There are many, Indian history is full of instances where people have been arrested and sometimes killed for their beliefs. So this is not something new. And what, again, kind of going back on what Tarun said, is that this is now the acceleration, the rate at which this is happening is, it does two things. One, it makes it difficult for many of us, whether you work as a lawyer, as an activist, as a journalist, as an academic, just simply even as an Indian citizen, where does your resources go in terms of resistance? What strategies of resistance? So we are constantly responding to something. So I think that is the first thing we really need to understand, is that the process is not just the punishment, it's also a noose around your neck. You never know when they're going to pull it up. They could pull it up anytime. Having said that, dissent, criminalization of dissent and resistance automatically translates to certain kind of censorship. Not now, and this has happened for quite some time. Around the time demonetization happened, I was in India and I reached out, and again, I was in Madras, which is supposed to be a lot more open. I went to 6 different public venues, asking them if we could host an event that would bring in economists and sociologists and political economists who could talk about demonetization in historical context. We never got a space for this. We couldn't get a public space to discuss. And finally, we said, why don't we just gather in someone's home? And the economist who promised would speak, then eventually said, you know what, I have a livelihood, I know I'm an economist. And then again, people kept saying things like, I'm not political, I'm an economist, I can talk about the economy. But even then the person dropped out. So this forms of self-censorship kind of has been happening. And I've seen this happen for a really long time. People are worried, people are concerned. So that self-censorship happened. Weeks before my book was going to go into print, I literally had to take people's names out of acknowledgements because I wasn't sure if acknowledging them would, because these are people who are not only rights defenders, but these are people who are in the communities. And we did take names off in the India edition. There was one person who, and a lot of the people that I interviewed soon after the NRCCA protest said that they no longer wanted to be a part of the book. So the book literally collapsed. Again, I'm using the book as an example, but so again, the fear of people not even wanting to have their stories told is one. And as I said, 2 weeks before the book was about to go to print for the India edition, there was one person who we had, again, the book, we tried to keep everything and everyone's names hidden. So if you had a name, the village would be a little bit, it'd be hard for you would locate a large geographical area. In this case, the person's name, the village was mentioned, and also the photograph was there. I totally forgot about it. My editor flagged it saying, what are we going to do? We made a decision to pull the image. And then somebody said, but it's such a stunning image. I said, no, it's unsafe. We do not know what's going to happen, right? So this is how censorship is already working. We're already censoring ourselves. Even those of us who want to be on the front line are very careful, right? So that censorship is already quite, it's everywhere. It's like the air you breathe. It's there. And I think all of this has very specific consequences to the public space. Now coming to the question of who are these people and why are they being criminalized? Almost everyone who's been arrested are people who have a relationship to their communities. These are people who understand their communities. These are people who can be they're not only eloquent voices of their community, but they're also people who allow others in their communities to be a part of the movement. The second thing we have to understand that almost all political parties in India have their origins in a student movement. So political parties in India, no matter who has power, have no investment in creating political movements or social movements, because often these political and social movements tomorrow often transform into political parties. There are very few political parties in India that did not start as a social or a political movement. So if you are a political party that has some kind of power capture, even in normal time, normal in whatever that normal means, you have an incentive to appropriate these voices, but not allow them to grow. And what we are really seeing is now a certain kind of acceleration. Like the acceleration means that you could get arrested for a tweet. You could get arrested for, in the US, you have something that says driving while Black. Now you can be arrested for being a comedian while being Muslim. Or you could be arrested for, so I think what we've really done is anything now can now be criminalized. There's a certain sense of fear. And that's why the CA NRC protests was such an important moment, because it brought communities who knew they were going to be criminalized, but still took that. There was a sense of community. And soon after that, that became a direct challenge. And what you really saw was these public spaces were then completely cleansed and cleared of violence. Feb 23rd happened for a very specific reason. It cleansed the public. Of course, we also had the pandemic. And I think this is how I would look at this in terms of dissent. You will go after anyone who represents a community and continues to advocate for them. Again, that's why Prashant Kanodia could be arrested for a tweet. Munawar Faruqi can be arrested for simply being a Muslim comedian. He didn't even perform that day. But also how people survive through the legal system is very important, right? Mr. Prashant Bhushan could be left out, as in a contempt case could be filed against him, but he would not serve any kind of prison time. But Prashant Kanodia would be picked up. Even after Prashant's bail came through, I think it took another 4 or 5 days for him to be physically released. And I think these are all the inherent inequalities, hierarchies, the inherent violence of our society, the injustice, the inequity. All of this is now expanding and exploding. And all of this will eventually have, it already does, have serious effects in terms of what it means for the fabric of a society. Once the fabric is gone, then no amount of institutions can really help you, because the social fabric is the foundation of institutional building. So once the institution, even if institutions exist, what will the institutions protect once the society is gone?
Right. Thank you, Suchitra, for that.
I just want to follow up a little bit on, because it's in the question Q&A that's come up, one of the questions sort of, connects to what you just said, Suchitra, was, that so much of the sort of targeting of, intellectuals, of writers, of lawyers has also been targeting, people from Dalit background, of, people who are from more, modest sort of working class backgrounds, and without sort of the sort of social and cultural capital, right, to sort of have some level of protection from this judiciary, and so so there was a question around that, about saying if it is really minorities and Dalit writers and intellectuals and artists who are being targeted, sort of how do we is there some way in which this really speaks to sort of the constitutional also crisis, right? In what ways can that be brought to the surface? That this is particularly targeting not just any kind of activist as well, but also particularly from these communities.
One of the things, a moment of political education for me was my first trip to Kashmir, and my friend now and then, someone that I was meeting for the first time to interview, said, you will always know how dangerous someone is by who's inside the prison and who the Indian state has let out. Very simple in the formulation, and this is someone who's been in the community. Again, I don't want to go into the Kashmirization of India argument, but that is true. I think if we look at it, who does the state keep inside, and who do they let out? And of course, you've had, communities that are the most, as I said, I don't like using the word marginalized, because increasingly I feel that it doesn't encompass or explain what these communities go through. Sorry, just one. Sorry, I have a 4-year-old and she's having a tantrum in the back. What we really see is that these communities, whether it is your Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, Muslim communities, all of these communities have been in receiving hand of various kinds of violence, physical violence, bureaucratic violence, all kinds of violence. For them, resistance is not just an act of courage or bravery. Resistance is an act of survival. If you do not resist, your community might be completely done away with. So I think it's very important for us to also not glamorize resistance as we the people on the front line, but for many of these communities, resistance is an act of survival of their community. And that again has a long history. Of course, those histories might not be easily excavated, those histories might not be easily taught. There's a lot of education that one has to think in terms of educating ourselves about the history. Kannabiran has this wonderful essay that actually talks about this. So I think that is a history of the Indian Republic. There's Rohit's book on the People's Constitution, and there's a lot of new scholarship that really kind of goes back at the heart of how these people have been in constant conflict with these constitutional institutions, have won, sometimes lost, but there's a constant back and forth. And I think that is very important for us to understand. And often it is these communities that have led the change through social movements, through pressing for it, through moving for it, through regularly petitioning the state, regularly petitioning the courts, failing but consistently doing it, finding ways of cooperation, resistance. That history has to be, I think, really understood for us. So longer terms, I think the strategies should be local. Another thing I just want to quickly mention is about a year ago, there was a sudden spike in violence against Dalit communities. And someone, again, that I speak to, who's a local stringer, said, Suchitra, it's very interesting. They're going after all the local leadership, all of the kids that they've beaten up, all of the people that they've picked up, are all people who are emerging as the young people who are then taking responsibility for the communities. These were people who are emerging as a possible local leadership. And it's very interesting that these are the kids who are being, picked up. And that's very interesting, because when you listen to a local stringer in a smaller town and they say that, look, they're picking up the exact kids, again, from Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi communities who could emerge. So what you really see is that kind of policing to suppress dissent and resistance is also ongoing. So again, as I said, this is a longer history, and it's very important for us to understand those nuances, but also not flatten it out as resistance as courage, fighting as liberatory. No, fighting sometimes is liberatory, sometimes it could also mean crushing or the entire community being subjected to violence.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Suchitra. I think it's time we move kind of more to looking forward. Many of the questions, some of the questions in the Q&A also speak to this. So Tarun, maybe you could take the general question posed both by Partha and Nandini in the Q&A. Partha's asking, well, what are the lessons we can learn from the emergency in terms of addressing the gaps and building towards a radical democracy? Nandini asks, really more, well, is there a course forward? Is there any ray of movement? Can you speak to that as a legal scholar? And perhaps I'd like to just focus that question more in the lines of what are the possible international angles of support and intervention and pressure that we might take forward from here.
Thanks very much, Shruti. So, I said I'm not optimistic. I should clarify. This is a lawyer and an academic, so lots of caveats, I'm afraid, right, in everything I say. but I should clarify that I'm not optimistic in the short term. But Indian democracy, for all its faults, and Indian constitutionalism, for all its faults, has survived, flawed and just barely, for long enough that in the long term, I don't think it's complicated, but freedom-seeking forces can be suppressed for too long. So I am hopeful, but not in the short term. And that sort of in some ways underpins my answer as well. I should also put another caveat, which is that in constantly harping on the fact that what is new is the volume and the frequency, but this has happened before and the system was fragile to begin with, is not at all to say that we are not in a crisis. And, just as Suchitra, very eloquently explained, even 10 years ago, criticizing a political party would not be an act of courage in India, except in a very local context. If you were criticizing the local strongman, usually a man, but other than that, right, criticizing a political party or a national leader in the abstract was not an act of courage. Religion, yes, possibly, right? So that has changed. So this fear that we could come after anybody with all guns blazing, and obviously if you compound that with the lack of material, cultural, educational, and social capital, that becomes worse, right? So we are in a moment of crisis, and I don't want to deny that at all. But to pick up sort of in some ways partisan in Nandini's questions, I think a lot of our responses have sought refuge in the wrong spaces, in the wrong sites. And it's partly because, you know, fascism flourishes when we start taking democracy and politics for granted. You know, politics, the only alternative to politics is violence and authoritarianism. So to my mind, the only viable response is, only hope we can have is in the opposition, not in the judiciary, not in the institutions, right? These institutions of this judiciary will be protected if we have a strong opposition. But, you know, remember that Indira Gandhi was defeated after the emergency because the left and the right could come together to fight her with one voice, right? Otherwise, there is no hope. So the opposition has to be united. We have to hold our noses. We may hate them for a multitude of reasons, but this is a question of the survival of Indian democracy. And we have to, and the opposition leaders, you know, the fate of the Congress is not an internal matter for the party. It's a problem for the survival of Indian democracy. The only constitutional institution that has stood up to the regime is federalism. And that's because opposition has access to state power through the states. We have to strengthen our federal system. You know, so I have been writing a lot about what can happen in, you know, in the moment of redemption, which may come after 5 years, which may come after 50, who knows, right? But so there are things we can do, but it's the political opposition, which I think is our ray of hope, as it were. And the final thing on sort of international angles for intervention pressure. Yeah, I think that, you know, redemption has to come from within India, as people, you know, Indians living abroad or non-Indians are concerned about the fate of Indian democracy. You know, the Constitution has provided a normative vocabulary, which has become the only normative vocabulary that this regime cannot dismiss out of hand. That it has to pay lip service to. We have to use that. We have to document for the future. We have to remember these stories and tell them again and again of what happens, the truth telling. This is an extremely thin-skinned regime. It is easily riled by the slightest of criticisms. That's why it comes after you. So you have to, in some ways, the insulation of being outside its reach is a power that has to be used to continue insisting on the truth. But beyond that, I think, you know, the change has to come from within the country, and outsiders, apart from solidarity and support and help with truth telling, can actually do more harm than good.
I'm going to, I know we're sort of almost running out of time. So you know, thank you so much, because it's been so valuable, you know, to have all of your perspectives, you know, on the table here. I'm going to ask the final question to Jed you know, on the subject of sort of, you know, how do we sort of strengthen democracy? The question of sort of software, technology, and, you know, all of this sort of, you know, digitalization, right? And the way in which the state can be sort of, you know, have this kind of power and control over, you know, infiltrating into citizens' lives. You know, to think, could you say a little bit about what are the ways in which, you know, there can be some democratization of sort of this sector of, you know, around technology, and what is, your own work on Net Alert, I think is very pertinent here. So if you could say a little bit, talk a little bit about your work in, and what Net Alert is about and what your work has been in this area, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And Net Alerts is a website that we started several years ago. And the idea was to have in cartoon form a way to convey technical ideas. So that was the original idea. And so there are things, hopefully I didn't give people a sense of hopelessness talking about remote access Trojans and you can't see it on your screen. There are things you can do to protect yourself, and it ranges from very simple things to very complex tools that are well supported, and anybody can use, and they're open source and they're there if you need them. But you can start with very simple changes. And Net Alerts was an attempt to get across what some of those simple changes are. So an example would be two-factor authentication. One of the things that we see governments do is hacking into people's Gmail accounts so they can see who are they talking to over email. And there's a very simple setting that you have to set it up, and then you have to learn how to use it. But it's not that complicated, where you can get a message on your phone and you can approve or disapprove of every login to your Gmail account. So even if somebody has your password, if they're able to phish your password or steal it, they're shoulder surfing you in the airport or something, and they have your password, if they don't have your cell phone, then they can't approve any login that uses that password. And so we tried to take that in cartoon form, and then we put them as a series of Net Alerts, and it grew into, we also have some visualizations in there, censorship, that are over time with timelines and everything. But I think the broader message is, that there is information out there about really simple things you can do to protect yourself. And then there are tools, if you, for example, are a journalist or an activist, you can use Signal instead of WhatsApp. And that's really easy to do. It's just as easy to use as WhatsApp. Or you can download the Tor browser. It's just like using Firefox as a browser, but it's configured to protect your privacy, protect your anonymity, hide who you're, what you're researching online. So like if you're a journalist and you want to find out, oh, my source, somebody's telling me they work for, this nuclear agency or something, is that true? And you go Google them, you just Googled your source's name out on the internet. But if you use the Tor browser, then you protected that. And that's what the Net Alerts project is just to tell people, that's a core of it anyway, is not everything that we do, but to tell people how easy it is to protect your online activities in that way. And there is an international community behind these tools, such as Tor, that for people from all levels, somebody who is just a regular citizen and just wants to protect themselves, versus somebody who's a highly targeted journalist, and there's a lot of state resources being put into finding out who their sources is. There's a whole spectrum of users that are supported by this community that is willing to help. So
Thank you so much for that. And I think there's a bunch of resources, that you've mentioned. If there's a way in which you can put that in the chat also for our attendees, that would be helpful. But I know we're out of time, and I think, it's been a really, very good, extensive discussion. And I think it's going to be time to call it to a close. I just want to say a word of thanks to our co-hosts for this webinar. There've been many different network organizations that have been part of hosting this: India Civil International, Ambedkar King Studies Circle in California, British Association for South Asian Studies, Scholars at Risk, the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis, University of Amsterdam, the Forum on Education in Asia at UCL in London, and the Southern Illinois University Honors Program. Thank you very much for helping us host this.
Thanks to all of you for a very illuminating conversation. I'd like to really thank all the panelists for your time, for your expertise, for your commitment, and your insightful contributions to this session. Thanks, everybody.
So
Yeah.
thank INSAF India for the invitation and for the fantastic work you're doing for academic freedom.
Thank you all very much for joining us today.